I'm here today to speak on using decision support tools or hydrological models around water management. In the SSRV specifically, those are the examples I'm going to use. If I have time, I'll actually talk about an example in the North Saskatchewan River Basin. But these are just hydrological models that can be used anywhere in the province, anywhere in the world, to look at supporting management decisions. And I'm going to use some examples from Alberta. So as I mentioned, I'll talk about modeling tools. I'll mention two projects, the Bow River project and collaborative modeling. It was an example of a project that finished in 2010. And then the ongoing SSRV adaptation project. I'll talk about some physically based modeling if I have some time, and then some of the next steps. So what is a model? Well, when we talk about models and hydrology and water management, we're typically talking about computer models. And a basic definition is a computer program that attempts to simulate a model of a particular system. And the word attempts there is very important because the old saying goes, all models are wrong, some are useful. Models are not perfect, but they're used as guides and directions of what could happen if you make changes to a system. In water resource work, there's many different types of models. There's groundwater models, there's hundreds of different types. I'm not going to go into them, but there's several different types that I've either used or use commonly. There's physically based models. Physically based models, they go by different names, but essentially they model the physical processes of hydrology. So they model evapotranspiration, precipitation, changes in soil, moisture, those sorts of things, and they generally produce an output of stream flow. So that's their output. Another type of model is mass balance model or accounting models. They're fairly simple models that look at the actual flows in the river and how they're managed, how the water's stored, how it's used, where it goes, how it's diverted, so on. There's also climate models that are used for hydrological decision support. These can be global climate models, GCMs, or regional climate models, RCMs. Both are used to look at future projections in climate and then associated changes to hydrology based on changes in climate. And then there's also water quality models. And as you have changes in flows, whether it's from changes in land use or changes in management practices, you can determine impacts or potential impacts to changes on water quality. So a couple of modeling basics. The models can evaluate alternatives. They can help provide credible basis for evaluations. In some instances, especially in the States, they can level negotiating fields and decrease the number of lawyers in the room, hopefully. They can educate parties to other people's objectives, and they can also be learned as an educational tool in terms of the physical reality of the system. Some people think that certain things are possible, and if you do X, that Y will happen, and that's not always the case. What models do not do is predict the future. A lot of people say, oh, and climate change models are predicting that. Models don't predict. Models project. Models can give you direction and magnitude of change, but they will not predict what will happen. Models need things, just like everything. Need something. Models need data. Without good data, you're kind of limited sometimes in what you can do with a model. And good data is important because if you put bad data into a model, you're going to get bad results out. So the old saying, garbage in, garbage out. So the Bow River project was a project that started up back in 2010, wrapped up in 2010 too, actually. And the objective was to model the Bow and its tributaries to look at remanaging flows for environmental sustainability and improvement in some cases, and to enhance social, economic development opportunities throughout the basin, all within accordance of the Water for Life goals that were set out by the province. The type of model that was used was a river mass balance model, fairly straightforward. You have nodes, which are the shapes. You have arcs, which are the arrows. They're connecting each other. And the nodes just represent either storage reservoirs or demands or just junction nodes in the model. This is the type of model that was used for this process. And it was used with a collaborative modeling process, which I'll speak on in a bit. The Bow River project was obviously done in the Bow River Basin. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, this is the Bow River Basin. It includes the city of Calgary, starts at the foot of the Bow Glacier at Bow Lake in the Rocky Mountains, travels through the mountains, the foothills, city of Calgary, and into the prairies. There's three large irrigation districts, the Bow River Western and Eastern irrigation districts, that are fed from the Bow River. flows. So again, stakeholders in the BOW wanted to get together. They had some different objectives and different issues, but the idea was to get together to look at collaboratively, how could we maybe remanage flows on the BOW, how could we remanage the system to get some of the benefits that we would like to see or like to probably get, and also secure water for future use, future development, and environmental protection. The participants listed all here. They held roughly 95% of the licensed water in the Bow Basin. So we had a lot of the major water players at the table. There was the City of Calgary, municipal groups, all the irrigation districts, Trout and Ducks Unlimited. University of Lethbridge was there, as well as 4 government departments at the time, which would now be 3 because ESRD is 1 department. But all were vital participants and part of this process that made it very successful. So how can we go and just remanage the BOW? Well, for those of you who don't know, the BOW is already managed. This is a hydrograph of calculated natural flow, which would be if there were no dams, if there were no weirs, no diversions on the Bow River, what would naturally be flowing down on an annual basis. So that's the blue line. The green line is what actually flows down the river. So because of on-stream storage in the headwaters, the water is actually captured in the spring, so resulting in lower spring flows, and released in the wintertime to provide higher flows. This causes benefits in the system, such as waste assimilation for the City of Calgary. It also creates some problems in the system, but overall there's pros and cons to everything. This is the upstream hydro sites owned by TransAlta that enable the management of the Bow system. There are several, I can't remember the number, 8 or 10 or 11 or so. There's different power plants. Some of them have fairly large reservoirs behind them. These reservoirs hold roughly 600,000 acre-feet of water upstream of the City of Calgary, and they're managed for hydropower development or hydropower generation. So they're not managed to meet other objectives specifically. They do in turn meet other objectives on the river, but they're primarily managed to produce hydropower for TransAlta. So one of the drivers, I guess, behind the Bow River project was recognizing that the Bow system wasn't just a stable, dynamic, or a stable system, it was dynamic, and that floods and droughts that we have seen in the historical record are probably not as bad as they have been in years beyond the historical record. This is a series of hydrographs. They're actually annual flows all the way back to the 1400s. You ask, how do we measure water all the way back to the 1400s? Dave Sachin at the University of Regina has done a lot of work with tree rings, and you can take old trees and have their tree rings. You can correlate the historical flows, so the last 100 years. You can correlate the flows record with tree rings and go back several hundred years to get approximate annual flows through the system. And what you can see is that the last 100 years that we've had gauging record for have been relatively stable. So the variance is those 2 dotted black lines. And in the historical tree ring record, you see there's been floods and droughts of greater magnitude and duration than anything we've seen in the historical record. So the fact that all of our infrastructure, all of our licensing, all of our water management is based on the last 100 years, how would we fare if something bigger or worse came along? There's also concern about growing water supply. You hear climate change, maybe it's human-induced, maybe it's not, I don't really care. Changes in climate happen, but one thing that is for sure is glaciers are changing. They're shrinking, they're decreasing in volume as glaciers shrink. The amount of water they produce every year also can go down. Glaciers are not a huge contributor to Bow flows. However, during low flow periods, dry years, or very hot times, they can be a significant contribution, especially for ecological purposes. So as I mentioned, hydropower has its good, has its bads. This would probably be one of the not so goods. This is Lower Kananaskis Lake. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, this is the Kananaskis Basin. And there's 2 lakes or reservoirs up in the upper portion of it, Lower and Upper Kananaskis Lake. Again, it's a hydro reservoir, so that's what it's used for. In September, it's filled up after spring and summer rains and snowmelt events. So it's full going into the winter. By the end of winter and spring, it's near empty. It fluctuates about 13.5 meters. Not good for fish. So to get back to the boat project, we used a collaborative modeling process. There's many different names for this: computer-aided negotiations, computer modeling for decision support, whatever you want to call it. There's 4 basic key steps that are used in this process. The first is the development of performance measures. The second is to build the model. Third is to test the model and develop alternatives, so alternative management solutions. And then fourth is reaching consensus and working towards implementation. So the first one, developing performance measures, or PMs. Performance measures are just simply graphical displays that actually show stakeholders in the room something that they're interested in, something that they care about so that the project is meaningful to them, and something that shows them the difference between model runs. So in the Bow River project, flows below Bassano were kind of used as a proxy for environmental improvements in the system, as an indicator of flows. If the water gets to Bassano, then it's gone through the whole system, so upstream is probably better than it was. The idea was the current base operations, which is how things are done today, versus 4 scenarios that were established for the Bow River project. How did they differ? So that's what performance measures do. So you build these with the stakeholders. I think there was 30 or 40 that were built, everything from fish spawning changes to changes in recreational days in Kananaskis to flow levels, shortages, changes in storage. Almost anything that you want can be looked at, and so that's what performance measures is. You build them, you get people interested in them, and that they can see the impacts of changes to their part of the system or something they're interested in. Again, for this particular performance measure, the idea was to get rid of the orange bars, the lower flows, increase the green bars. So obviously some scenarios did that better than others. So that's what performance measures are for. The next step is to build the model. The steps 1 and 2 usually happen in sequence, but you got to collect the data to get the model working. This includes reservoir storage information, physical capacities of the system, inflow data, demand data, storage data, etc. The model and the data are then vetted by the stakeholders, so they have to be able to see the data you've put in. They have to be able to see your assumptions with the data, how you're working it, how it works together, and then when you start looking at output, if something doesn't look right, you go in and you fix it until it starts looking accurate. Again, no model is perfect. All models are wrong. Some are useful. So the idea is to get at least a physical reality of the system so that stakeholders can start looking at alternatives. Step 3 is to then develop and test the model and the alternatives. So during this process, this is the what ifs. And when we have these collaborative modeling sessions, nothing's off the table, so to speak. You could think of something really wacky, like let's build a dam and flood out Calgary if we could, or anything you want. You can model it. It doesn't mean it'll happen, but you can model it, and that's the good thing about a model. So you can do what if, typical things that happen in the Bow were, let's change minimum flow targets. Do I really have to send that much water through this time of year? Can I change when I fill my reservoirs? Can I create new storage? Can I take storage out? What can I do? So these are all the things you can do, and as you do these in a collaborative setting, people start to see options that they might not have thought of, and ideas start to change, and eventually you start reaching consensus on some of the better ideas. That's the 4th step, is to reach consensus and implementation. So eventually you want to work towards something that you can actually recommend for actual changes. So for the Bow project, there was actually 4 scenarios that the group kind of finalized on, scenarios 1 through 4, with the scenario 3 being the preferred scenario. So the scenario that if we were actually going to change flows, this is probably how we do it. Each of the scenarios consisted of a couple key points. The first was stabilizing lower Kananaskis Lake. So I showed you the drop, 13.5 meters from full to empty. The idea with stabilizing the lake is that it would fluctuate. I think it's half a meter, maybe 1 meter tops over the year. And then in turn, you're stabilizing the river below it. That creates fish habitat, recreational opportunities, etc. So that was built into all 4 scenarios, as well as a doubling of storage in the Western Irrigation District. And then the concept of a water bank was brought into a couple of the scenarios. And essentially a water bank is using the existing on-stream storage that TransAlta currently has, and the stakeholders being able to rent a bucket, so a portion of all of that upstream storage. TransAlta could pull it however they wanted to, but the idea is that when stakeholders called for it, TransAlta would release it. Rather than releasing it when they wanted to for hydropower, TransAlta would have to release it when the stakeholders called them to release it. Now again, this was all just modeled, but that's kind of the concept of a water bank in terms of remanaging. So rather than building new storage, you just manage differently what was there. So scenario 3 was the ultimate preferred scenario that was recommended after the project completed. So the BRP did yield significant results. We showed that remanagement of the bow was possible and that was actually beneficial. There was protection for water sources for economic and municipal growth for up to 50 years or longer. We produced healthier in-stream aquatic ecosystems, fisheries, and riparian zones. The opportunity for sufficient water for irrigation needs and expansion, as well as a renewal of the Kananaskis system through stabilizing the lake and the river. And we achieved the Water for Life goals. The recommendations would have a cost. Obviously, TransAlta would be losing revenue from changing how they operated strictly for hydropower, but the costs were relatively modest, and things could be implemented in a stepwise fashion. So on the heels of the Bow River project, which wrapped up in 2010, is what Jim talked about today, the CCEMC funded project is the SSRV, or the South Saskatchewan River Basin Adaptation Project. The project builds on the work that the Bow did, but focuses on adaptation. So how would you adapt to changes in climate and how changes in climate might impact future flows? And then how would you adapt to them and try to build a robust set of adaptation options for adapting to changes in climate. The work would continue the work on the Bow and also start building a river system model for the Oldman and the South Saskatchewan River Basins. The project is 2 years. It should be wrapping up in spring of 2014. Again, it's funded by the CCEMC, or the Climate Change Emissions Management Corporation. It was one of several adaptation projects like Jim spoke about this morning. The project budget is $1.6 million. There have been add-ons such as NSERC. They helped fund the portion of the developing the climate scenarios that we worked with David Sachin from the University of Regina. It's being executed by WaterSmart and Alberta Innovates and Energy and Environment Solutions. And then we continually engage experts from wherever we need them throughout the course of the project. So since it is an adaptation project and we're looking at climate change or climate variability and change or just changes in climate, I just want to clarify what a change in climate is and what climate change is, because still when I hear climate change, I think human-induced GHGs and all that fun stuff that people associate climate change with over those words. But climate is just the statistics of weather. So if you take the statistics of something that change, that's by nature that means climate changes. There's two different statistics that we talk about in association with climate change. There's changes in the mean. So if you have an increase in the mean annual temperature of something, you're getting warmer, so you're getting more warm. If you have an increase in the variance or an increase in the extremes, you're actually not changing your mean temperature, but you're just getting more extreme. So more hot or dry, more cold or wet. With climate change, you're expecting shifts in both. So if you do get a shift in mean, if the global mean temperature is actually increasing, you get a shift in the mean temperature, you can also get a shift in the extremes. The probability of having longer droughts, more prolonged droughts, more severe droughts is higher. So you get a higher probability of more extremes and more extreme dry periods. So when you hear about these things, that's what the climate models are looking at, and that's what they're kind of forecasting and indicating. So for this work, again, we worked with Dr. David Sachin out of the University of Regina and his team to develop 50 scenarios. I'm not going to talk about how those scenarios were developed. That's a whole other presentation. If you want to talk to me afterwards, I'll be around. The idea was that we developed 50 climate change scenarios, each 30 years in length, to give us 50 probable projections of future climate and the impacts on hydrology. So we got 50 time series of 30 years in length of daily hydrological flows. Of those 50, we chose 5 to work with for the group sessions, so the collaborative modeling session with the stakeholders. We chose 5 because 5 is a manageable number, 50 isn't. We chose 3 kind of dry years. They were based on the 1, 2, or 3 consecutive year min flows at the 10th percentile. So we didn't want to choose the extreme outliers, but we wanted to show something that was relatively reasonable and that actually gave the stakeholders something to test adaptation options against. We also chose 2 kind of median years to kind of show an average year and to show that not all climate projections are gloom and doom. And also to make sure that when we were testing adaptation strategies, that something we wanted to do for a dry period didn't impact something that a management strategy that would be used in an average year, because you don't want to plan for the worst and then make average years bad. So the 5 chosen scenarios were graphed here. These are a graph of weekly average mean flows below Bassano. So basically, it's the average of all 30 years, or in the historical case, 67 years. So the dark black line is the historical 67-year average. So that just shows, and that's on there to show you that the 2 median scenarios, the 1-year median and the 2-year median, they're fairly average. What we've seen in the historical record, yes, there's some wet years in there, yes, there's some dry years in there, but overall it's fairly average. Now when you get down into the 1, 2, and 3-year min scenarios, they're a bit drier. They were chosen because of their 1, 2, or 3-year extreme years, but again, it's a 30-year time series and it's just 1, 2, or 3 years in those years that are bad, but overall those scenarios, the 30 years, were quite dry. I graphed the 2000 to 2001 flows because that was a very dry year in the bow, and that just kind of gives you some context as to how dry those 3 scenarios are. So this is the bow model that was built during the Bow River project and enhanced during the SSRV adaptation project. Again, you see the nodes, the reservoirs, you see red boxes, which are demand nodes, and then a bunch of junction nodes. It's the Bow River operational model, or BROM. It's kind of blown out in different sections, but this is the TransAlta upstream reservoirs, upstream of Calgary. You have the City of Calgary, the Western Irrigation District, the Eastern Irrigation District, the Bow River Irrigation District, and the recent addition of the Highwood and Sheep Rivers. So again, for the Bow River project, it was modeled from headwaters to confluence with the Old Man. And so these climate scenarios that were developed, the daily time series of projected changes in climate and how they impact hydrology, they were input into this model so we could see, first of all, what are the impacts on the system, and then how would you adapt to them. So I'm going to go over some of the preliminary results. These were showed to the stakeholders, and these are the worst of the worst. But again, these are some of the impacts that future low flows could have on the system. Based on what we call robo-river, so this is just the model running with the rules that we put into it saying you must do this. Obviously humans are a lot smarter than the computer and the model, so they would be able to manage the system better than this right off the bat. But these are the results just based on robo-river. So the first impacts you see here, this is TransAlta storage up here, so total system storage upstream of Calgary. By the end of a really long dry period during the 3-year min scenario, TransAlta empties out. Now it empties out because the model is forcing it over all the years in that run to meet a minimum flow through Calgary. It doesn't have to do that. TransAlta doesn't have to do this. There's no agreement that says TransAlta must do this, but they do it. Typically they do it because the lowest flows are in the wintertime, and TransAlta naturally releases more in the wintertime to generate more power. But in the model, we wanted to make sure that TransAlta always did that. So that's why it empties out, is because it's forcing itself to do that. Again, humans would probably do a better job of this if they saw problems coming. But as a result of that, so if TransAlta did do that, Calgary, the 1250 CFS, so cubic feet per second, drops below what they would want to see. So CFS, 1250 CFS is a flow that Calgary likes to see primarily for waste assimilation. So dissolved oxygen concerns, fish habitat, there's a trout fishery downstream of Calgary, which is important. So they like to keep those flows high. For about 3 or 4 weeks, they drop to 600 CFS in the spring. Not something they would want to see, but there's no other options. There's no more water in the system. TransAlta empties out, the flow drops to natural flow, and it doesn't come back up to the 1250 CFS until natural flow comes up, and TransAlta has little blips in here. You can't see it because of the scale, but there are little blips where TransAlta actually gets a little bit of water, but again, they have to let it go right away based on the model rules, which can be changed. Storage on Glenmore. Glenmore Reservoir is on the Elbow River, which is one of the water sources for the city of Calgary. Glenmore empties out. If Glenmore empties out, your only other water source is the Bow River. And again, that doesn't mean that the city of Calgary is going to run out of water, but it could mean distribution problems for the city. Shortages at Okotoks. Okotoks is on the Sheep River. I don't know if any of you have heard about the news with Okotoks and the news stories around their water. They're trying to get water licenses and trying to live off just the Sheep River alone. But in this scenario, they run out of water. They run out of most of their water for a couple months in the summer. They have several licenses, some of which are senior to the in-stream objective, some of which are junior to the in-stream objective. If it's junior, they can't pull water unless that in-stream objective is met. So the green line is their demand, what they want. The red line is what they're getting, so they're getting maybe a fifth of what they want. And the blue line is their shortage. Irrigation districts saw shortages. Some of them are just because of headwork shortages, but again, those can be fixed. But shortages, and Richard, I don't know if these are manageable or not, but from the Bow River project, everything that came up in terms of shortages were manageable, but again, there's shortages throughout the system in the irrigation districts. Again, this is because the irrigation districts do not call priority in the model, do not call priority on junior licenses. The districts will take the hit and let the junior licenses have their water first. Again, that could change in life if they really wanted to, but the way they operate is that the senior licenses take the hit. So from some of these, once we went through the impacts of the scenarios, we started coming up with some potential adaptation strategies. And these are the what-ifs that the stakeholders started testing in the meeting. And some of them were restore Spray River, or Spray Reservoir, which is in the headwaters of TransAlta Reservoir. If you actually fix the reservoir so it can be filled to its full capacity, you get 60,000 acre-feet of more storage. Building an off-stream storage in the Western Irrigation District. Moving the municipal licenses from the Highwood and Sheep, so all the municipal licenses on those river systems, and then taking the water from the Bow instead of using the Highwood Sheep River to avoid shortages for Okotoks. Building new on-stream storage below Bassano, changing the minimum flow requirements that must be passed through the city of Calgary. So rather than flowing that 1250 CFS all the time, is there periods of time where we could take that, lower it down a bit to save a little more water in the headwaters? That's most likely what people would do. So these are just a list of some of the preliminary ones. They're being cleaned, those runs are being cleaned up right now, and will be brought back to the stakeholders at our next meeting, I think the beginning of May. So that was the Bow River project, the collaborative modeling process, and the SSRV project. So right now we're wrapping up the Bow work. The Old Man in South Saskatchewan model is currently being built, and the idea is to hopefully start looking at some what-if scenarios by summertime, I'm guessing. So another component of hydrological modeling is physically based modeling. This was some work that I did in the North Saskatchewan River for my thesis, but again, this can be applied anywhere in Alberta or the world. So a physically based model, again, it models the hydrological processes, it models stream flow as an output, but it can model everything from surface water, soil water, storage, snowpack changes, precipitation changes, etc., evapotranspiration. And how it's done is you do it per watershed, so when you get an outflow of or an output, you have to compare it to something to make sure you're actually modeling correctly. And so you use you use stream gauges to say, and you want to match the stream gauges, so you have output and simulated, or simulated and actual. Thank you, recorded. Brain fart there. So you want to have something to compare it against to validate your output. I'll skip over this for time. But it was done on HRUs, which are hydrological response units. So every unit in the system is modeled the same, so that you have areas that are hydrologically the same, modeled the same. The idea, again, is to verify that your model is working. So you want to make sure that you have good output, but you have it for the right reasons. Because you can tweak a model to get the end output the same as your observed, but you want to make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. So in this instance, we actually verified that we were simulating temperature properly. We verified that we were simulating potentially evapotranspiration properly, snow depth and snow water equivalent, glacier mass balance, because glaciers are big in the North Saskatchewan, or at least bigger than in the Bow, as well as stream flow. So you want to make sure that you're getting your seasonalities right, you want to make sure that you're getting the magnitudes right, and you want to make sure that overall your observed is similar to your simulated. Then once those variables are all checked, you do streamflow verification. I'm not going to go over the statistics, but for the North Sask, they were pretty good. Again, you want to make sure that your standard deviation is good, your variance is good, and that not just your R squared, because really you can have a slope and it not really mean much if all your numbers are off. So you really want to make sure that you verify it properly with the right statistics. And again, here's the output from the observed and simulated for the Klein River, which is in the uppermost part of the North Saskatchewan River watershed. This is monthly stream flow output. So you can see that the model is simulating roughly the same monthly hydrographs. You're getting the seasonal and annual values right, as well as the magnitudes. And then in terms of daily hydrograph, when you start getting into the daily, you want to make sure that the peaks are in the same places. You want to make sure that the recession curves are at the same times. And you want to make sure that the low flows and high flows are roughly the same. You're never going to get perfect. You're trying to model a physical system, but you want to make sure it's close, and again, for the right reasons. And this is just a graph of all the historical data that we had. So again, some years you're under-simulating, some years you're over-simulating. Most of the time you're bang on. You're never going to get it right, but you want to make sure you're close. So once you've built a physical model and you can show that you've modeled what's happened, then you can have confidence in the model to say, what if we had changes in climate? What if we had changes in land use or land cover? Then you can feed that kind of information into the work that was done for the Bow River project or is being done for the Old Man or the SSRV project. So you can look at changes of climate or land use on the hydrology and then say, how would that hydrology, how would that water in the river be managed now that it's changed? So some of the next steps that we're going to hopefully be doing in the next couple of years. So again, the Bow River project took care of the Bow Basin, and we've added in the Highwood Basin, the Old Man in South Saskatchewan, and the southern tributaries as part of the Old Man. They're being added in now. The next step is to take the Red Deer, add the Red Deer model in, and integrate it all so that we have one SSRV model, so that you can look at impacts throughout the entire basin, management changes or opportunities at a basin-wide scale. So rather than looking at individual systems separately, you're looking at the entire system as one whole piece. Another next step is, once we have that integrated model, is to start doing some of this physically based modeling in the basin. So you can actually start looking at changes in land cover, changes in land use, and how those affect runoff, timing of runoff, magnitude of runoff, etc. And the other thing is, with global climate models and even regional climate models, if you have a physically based system like this, you can actually take the precip and temperature outputs from this, run it through the physically based model, and again, provide more output and different output to explore different scenarios and what-if scenarios around management practices and opportunities for adaptation in the mass balance models. And again, this is all geared towards management, providing water managers with information and adapting to changes in the system. So just in summary, there's still a lot of work to be done. This is only a couple of years worth of work. There's model integration, there's physically based modeling. Collaborative, innovative work is key in terms of advancing integrated water management and can yield significant results. When you work together with people and you get different perspectives in the room, people start learning, people start thinking differently, and when you get different lenses on different problems, sometimes you start getting better solutions. Changes in climate will present challenges to water management. That's been documented several times in the literature. What those changes are exactly, we don't know, which is why when we do this kind of work, we look at a range of changes in climate. how could it change? How might it change? We don't know how it's going to change, but if we can adapt to a range, then we're probably looking pretty good for the future. And then challenges will provide opportunities for innovation, and I think Alberta is one of the great places to be in order to do that, because a lot of the work that's being done through the WPACs and through organizations that are looking at water is looking at these innovative solutions, and collaborative modeling really helps that. So that's one of the tools in the toolbox that Albertans can use. So I don't think it's a bad news story. There will be changes, but I think we're in a good position to deal with most of them.